Conservation credits, the thing you need to get some of the cooler animals in Planet Zoo. And a thing I need, or maybe not need, but a thing I want to have a steady stream of before I start my next random zoo, so we're making a zoo with nothing but cheetahs. And the zoo you're gonna see me make is actually the second attempt at the zoo because my first attempt went haywire and it wasn't bringing me joy, so I collected all my cheetahs and made a better plan. I'm also showing off my amazing, just can't be topped creative naming skills here. But my better plan was to actually massively simplify my design. I started with making a circle several times before landing on this asymmetrical one that would work perfectly for what I needed it for. I added staff buildings and started laying down the path for the rest of the zoo, and once I had that mapped out, I built the first habitat. Or at least I tried to, but it was a touch too small, so some reworking of the path later and I had an adequately sized habitat for the first cheetah. And I kept the habitat design fairly simple. I added one of the shelters the game offers you and filled it with bedding, before throwing down the food and toy enrichment and giving them a little pond to drink from. Also, I realized while making this zoo that I could totally do more with the water. Typically I just throw it in the habitat wherever it'll fit, but I could definitely use it to enhance the overall look of the habitat. That's just something I wanted to keep in mind when working on future Planet Zoo stuff. And after adding the water, I placated their terrain needs by throwing about some short grass, soil, sand, and then some long grass to top it all off. And there were already people clamoring in to come see these nifty big cats, so I quickly went about adding the trees and bushes to finish the habitat off. And unfortunately, I couldn't get too zealous with the plants because of the low coverage needs, but I think it looked good enough. Good enough for a conservation credit zoo, at least. By the way, watching them pick up this thingy is very entertaining. He's got it hanging from his bottom teeth or something, I don't know. Something's wrong with this image, but I can't say I'm mad about it. The cheetahs were also getting stressed, so I switched the fencing to one-way glass to help with that. I also went about placing donation bins, and I don't really need to do this since I'm only trying to get conservation credits, but when I tried this the last time I quickly went into debt, and I at least need the zoo to be making money at the start so I can afford to add in all the animals and make something at least somewhat decent looking. Which also means making the guests happy, so I made this nifty looking canopy thing and placed a couple coolers down so that they'll give me more money. And after doing that, I let the game run, and there were eventually some cute little cheetah cubs on their way. Oh, what's also nifty is that some of them came out with the spotless coat pattern, which I got from the very first conservation credit zoo I had, so that's neat too. But now that there were babies, I needed an overflow area, considering I only built the habitat large enough to house 2 cheetahs, so the babies were going to need to move out sooner rather than later. By the way, I didn't realize this at first, but she had 4 cubs, which is just a nice amount considering the max they can have is 5. I think how it works is the higher the fertility trait, the more likely they will get pregnant, but also the more babies they can produce. And I just think that's a fun and nifty game mechanic. And after they were moved, I went about making something pretty similar to the first habitat. I will say though, I tried to use a different shelter for each habitat just so that it would be a little less repetitive and boring, since the enrichment and basically everything else would be the same considering they're all, cheetahs. It's a cheetah zoo, so, things don't vary much. I also used a different tree for each habitat, and I think in the end, it looked rather cool. After I was done making the overflow area, I made a drink and food area for the guests. And after that was done, I let the game run for a while to gather a good amount of money, with some brief interludes to add benches, collect some matured cheetahs, which I didn't sell at this point, by the way. I wanted to have a nice amount stored for the next habitats. And finally adding some more drink shops before letting 5 years pass and amassing a large sum of money. And with that large sum of money, I set up the rest of the habitat barriers and selected a pair of cheetahs from the large amount of them I'd amassed. And after the first one arrived, I went about setting up what is essentially the same habitat as the other 2, except this time I used this shelter with a red roof and some of these river bush willow trees. They were a nice orange color, and I thought it was a fun contrast to the trees I'd used so far. And after completing the 3rd habitat, I jumped right into making the 4th. I did get distracted for a brief second watching this cheetah play with the box, though. It greatly amused me. But back to what I was doing. I used this brick shelter in this habitat and went about adding the bedding. Also, I've been placing coolers in each of the habitats. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet. But yeah, the environment I chose was just too hot for the cheetahs and their welfare was going down because of the heat. So I just threw in some coolers and solved the issue. And while I was working on adding the coolers to this habitat, I got the little red circle of death, letting me know my internet was down. I really hate this stupid little red circle. Nevertheless, though, I reloaded the game and finished adding the enrichment and giving them water before choosing these African oil palms to litter around their habitat. And since those didn't really take too much coverage, these guys also got some bushes as a special treat. I added donation bins around the new habitats, along with education speakers, and the power I currently had set up was just short of powering all of that, so I made another shopping area in the back corner and hid another transformer behind them. I also repeated that on the other side because I was going for something somewhat symmetrical, or at least as symmetrical as you can get it when you start with an asymmetrical circle. And before I wrapped up this side of the zoo, I placed some benches and trash cans around before adding one of the canopy things in front of each habitat. And while it was looking just a touch repetitive, I was pleasantly happy with how it was looking so far. And with that side done, I wasted little time before selecting the next couple of cheetahs and adding them to a habitat. Also, we're gonna breeze through these last 4 habitats because they're very similar to the first 4 and I don't want to sound too repetitive. I followed the same pattern of using a different shelter and a different tree, and that's literally the only thing that changes throughout these 4. And I just don't know what else to talk about when it comes to that. What I do want to talk about, though, is how much I appreciate all the support my last Planet Zoo video got. It was really neat, and even though I'm not the best at responding to comments, I tried my best to read all of them, and I just wanted to say thank you. Now back to the cheetahs. This last habitat I made is my favorite. I just really like the tree and bush combination I used. Yeah, but I wrapped this habitat up and was hemorrhaging money. But that's fine because after a short time I had about doubled my conservation credits, so that's a win. And it's also the whole purpose of making this zoo. As much as I like making successful zoos, I'm willing to take the L on this one. I could have also just not chosen hard mode for this zoo, that probably would have worked in my favor. I do think after a certain point, no matter what though, that there's only so many guests you can get to come into your zoo with one species of animal. But the main purpose of this one was for conservation credits, so I'm not bothered, but I just figured it was worth mentioning. One thing I was bothered by though was the naked buildings, so I got to working on fixing that. I used this painted brick wall for the staff buildings and changed it to a nice shade of red with a clay tiled roof on top and the painted clay roof around the edge. And I did this for all the staff buildings, including the generators on either side of the zoo. I even added this door that I had to meticulously place into each door frame. But I now had some nice looking staff buildings around the zoo. But the shops were still bare, so I got to covering them up. And initially I started with something relatively simple. I used the brick walls and added some sandstone brick walls for a nice color combination. I even used this little brick column thing just because I thought it looked fun. And then came the roof. At first I just added a flat wood roof. And then I had the idea to do some sort of vegetation-filled terrarium on top. And I don't know how realistically this would work, but luckily enough, this is a video game, so I get to do what I want. And I wanted weird little half-open terrarium things on top of my shops. So that's exactly what I did before deciding the side of the buildings looked way too plain with all that going up on top. So I pulled out these grapevines and sunk them into the side of the buildings to add some clutter to the bottom as well. And I spent forever doing this, but I really like the cluttered, overgrown look it gave, so I'm okay with that. To finish off this shopping area, I added a little water area and copied the plants at the entrance of the zoo to fill out the empty space on either side. I even went through and sprinkled some grass into the sand to add some texture. And I think this area wrapped up looking really cool, and it makes me want to design a zoo with like an overgrown kind of vibe to it. I just think that would look nifty and fun. I spent quite some time doing the same design for the other 2 shopping areas on either side of the zoo. And when that was wrapped up, the inside area of the zoo was looking pleasant, but the outside was still barren, so I worked on that next. I copied all the plants around the entrance again and scattered a couple clusters of them around. And then in some of the larger blank spaces, I added some little ponds, or whatever you'd like to call them. I used these umbrella thorn acacia trees last to fill out any area that looked too thin, and when I was done with that, I had a zoo that I was decently happy with. The zoo was still hemorrhaging money, but the Cheetah Cup output was looking really good, and that's what really counts. And with a nice supply of conservation credits, I finally have the means to start my next random zoo. So I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did enjoy watching, maybe consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!